On the night before Jesus was arrested, he shared a meal with his disciples. This meal is what we know today as believers as the Lord's Supper. And even as Jesus passed that bread and passed the cup amongst his disciples, and even though he explained to them that this bread would represent his body and this cup would represent the blood that would be poured out for his disciples, they still didn't fully understand and grasp exactly what was going to happen in that next day. They couldn't even been ready or imagined what would happen or what would occur. Even though Jesus had warned them and told them that the Son of Man must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things and be put to death, they were still trying to avoid it. Later on, after Jesus is betrayed by Judas and he's brought before the Sanhedrin, Jesus is then brought before Pilate and he is sentenced to be crucified. Crucifixion was arguably the most gruesome and graphic and violent way that you could die and be put to death in the Roman world. Jesus, before he even went to the cross, was severely beaten. He was beaten to the point that most before him that had endured this sort of punishment would have already been dead. So after Jesus was severely beaten, he was forced to carry his cross. And Jesus at this point was at a state that he couldn't even fully carry his cross all the way to Golgotha, where he was eventually put to death. A man named Simon, we're told in Mark, of Cyrene, was asked to help Jesus carry his cross the rest of the way. And so we pick up in Mark chapter 15, verse 23. So after they had brought him to Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, they then offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. And it was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So you who are going to destroy the temple and build it up in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down from the cross that we may see and believe." And those crucified with him also heaped insults at him. So here's Jesus on the cross, already been severely beaten, forced to carry his cross away. He's nailed to the cross, and Mark tells us that he's up on the cross for approximately 6 hours. Verse 33 of Mark chapter 15, "At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried in a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." And someone ran, they filled a sponge with wine vinegar, and they put it on a staff and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down." With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." And so Jesus is crucified on this cross. He's there for 6 hours. The way that you typically died from crucifixion is that you suffocated to death. That your lungs would literally fill with blood as you suffocated and died in just pure agony. The pain, the excruciating suffering that Jesus went through on the cross is something that many of us will never even get close to that type of pain. And as Jesus is up there, alone, insults hurled at him from both the ground and even from those that are being crucified with him, is what Mark tells us. Jesus alone, suffering, dying in our place, in your place, in my place on the cross. We know that many of the disciples have fled. We know that Peter, the night before, had denied even knowing Jesus. One of the gospel accounts tells us that John and his mother Mary were at least present, But for the most part, Jesus spent this agonizing time with insults hurled at him and alone on the cross. After Jesus had breathed his last and cried out that it is finished, he was taken down from the cross and he was placed in a tomb. So now we look at the disciples in this moment. Not much is known. John's account tells us that after Jesus' resurrection appearance, that he appeared to the disciples in a room that was locked. And so we can kind of infer that the disciples were in hiding. They were scared. They were afraid. Everything that they had known and what they'd given their lives up to follow was gone in an instant, really. They had visions of Jesus riding into Jerusalem and overtaking Jerusalem to show that he was the true Messiah. They didn't expect for their leader, their Messiah, and who they believed was the Son of God to be crucified in the most horrific fashion. They had no idea what was going to come next. And I think as we walk into this weekend, we know the good news. We know what happens on Sunday. We know that Jesus comes out of the tomb. We know that the tomb is empty, and we celebrate that today. But for the disciples, they didn't know what was going to come next. Some of them may have remembered and brought up the fact that, well, didn't Jesus say that he was going to be raised on the third day? Maybe that was what he was talking about when he was talking about the temple being built back in 3 days. But as Friday night and Saturday night begin to draw closer, and Sunday morning, that third day, I have to believe that the disciples were wondering, what if he doesn't come back out of the grave? What if he isn't really alive? What if he wasn't the Messiah? There's a lot of questions and doubts that grip their hearts and minds in those moments. And as believers today, like I said, we know the good news of that Sunday with an empty tomb, but we also experience our own set of fears and anxieties and worries, especially as we're in the moment of this pandemic. There's fears of, is Jesus still with us? Is he still here? Why are these things happening? We may be questioning and uncertain about what the future holds. But as we celebrate the Lord's Supper this Sunday, it's a reminder to us that Jesus is with us despite circumstances. But it's also pointing to a promise that one day that we'll share that meal again with Jesus face to face. For the disciples, they didn't know it at the time, but Jesus was promising them that he would be with them and that what he was doing, going to the cross, being crucified, being buried, was for the disciples, was for us, that his body was going to be broken for them, his blood was going to be shed for them. And so, church family, I would just invite you over this weekend as we prepare for Easter Sunday, that despite your anxieties or fears or worries, that one, we would in some ways identify with the disciples, that we would know that they were in that same boat, in that same place. But we'd also remind ourselves of the good news that regardless of our circumstances, regardless of what's going on in our world, regardless of whatever's going on the news or your Twitter feed or whatever it may be, that tomb's empty and Jesus is alive. But also, let that supper that we celebrate in our homes, even though we're distanced from one another, let that time in our homes remind us that even though we are socially distancing from one another, that Jesus isn't at a distance. That in that moment, Jesus is with us. It's a reminder of his work for us, but it also points to a promise that one day, no matter what goes on, no matter our circumstances, that one day that we will celebrate this supper again, face to face with our Lord. Church, we love you. We're praying for you in this time, and we look forward to the day that we're able to celebrate again in person.